Так, усім добрий вечір. Я думаю, можна потроху
Good
починати.
evening, everyone.
Мене звати Антон. Я
I
сьогодні
think we should start. I'm Anton,
собі монітором цього заходу.
who will be helping this event today.
У нас запланована лекція
We
на годину.
are looking forward to a lecture for 16 minutes from Carl Castro. And after the lecture, we will have 30 minutes in addition for questions that we may have for our American speakers. For questions, you can raise your hands here in Zoom, and I will give you opportunity to speak, or you can write in the chat, and then we will read it. Please mind that we have simultaneous interpretation. If you need it, you will need to find a globe icon on your screen, and there you need to select Ukrainian. If you are okay with listening to English, you can stay with the original audio. What we're going to have today is a webinar, like I said, a lecture, and then some questions. The topic of today's lecture is corrosion in the army, factors that impede the army. So, Carl, over to you. I think we can run the presentation, and we shall go.
It's a real pleasure to kick off our lecture series starting in the fall. As you know, we were on a bit of a break early, and I have agreed to give this lecture. It's a lecture that many have requested. I was always I'm ambivalent a little bit about giving this lecture because I always wonder how relevant the specific topics are. But what I wanted to really demonstrate is the types of really tough questions that we grapple with in the U.S. that are really difficult. They're one of those wicked problems, if you are all familiar with that concept, which means as you try to solve the problem, oftentimes you uncover other problems, and it becomes this very difficult problem to solve. But I'm going to show you how we try to approach these very difficult, sometimes intractable, sometimes perennial problems. So next slide shows my outline. If we could just bring that up. And, for those of you who had heard me speak before, I always start with an outline, which basically I tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I tell you what I told you. This is the old Army way of giving information to soldiers, so it's hard for me to break that. But I would like to just say that this concept of tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, was actually discovered in academia at the request of the military, saying, what's the best way to train soldiers? And they say, well, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it hopefully in a friendly way, and it's not going to be this sort of top-down. I also want to say that I am not going to cover all the information on all of the slides that are in the packet, but you are all welcome to them. They'll be distributed, they'll be posted. So I just don't want you to get too concerned if I go a little fast or skip a few slides. It's really, I think it's more important that I sort of lay out what we talk about, and then some issues that we talked about in the past, and maybe some that we should be talking about that we're not yet talking about, and then really get your feedback about those issues that you think are unique to the Ukrainian current experience, understanding the past experience as well. So next slide. I just want to point out that for many folks, so next slide. I just want to point out for many folks that the idea of behavioral health and the interest in behavioral health is global. So, this webinar, I think you all know, you're part of a community now, you're part of a world family where everyone is concerned about the behavioral health of the military. And when I say the military, I mean service members, those still serving, veterans, and their families. So when you see me say words like military, that's what I mean. I mean those serving, veterans, and their families. And even broader, one could think of the community as well. So don't think of it in a narrow, only active duty folks, but think more broadly, more inclusive. And of course, NATO is very, very, very much engaged in behavioral health issues. And maybe at some point I'll talk about some of my activities in NATO for a future lecture. Next slide. Now, one of the things to really appreciate is that when you talk about things like corrosives, and I will be honest, I'm not sure exactly how that word translates to the Ukrainian, but a corrosive is something that's negative in the US. So from an English speaking, a corrosive is something negative, and I'll talk more about that definition. But since it's negative, I don't want folks to think that the military is a negative experience. It has negative aspects to it. Of course it does. But there's so many positive things about life in the military. And so this slide here is really just trying to capture those positive aspects of military service. So when we start being critical and self-reflecting on things we need to do to improve, we shouldn't ever lose sight that the military is a really positive influence on people's lives and the larger society. I know that that's a debatable issue, but I feel very strongly that military service is a very honorable profession. It allows one to grow. It strengthens an individual. Veterans strengthen the communities that they're members of. They strengthen a nation. And so this, again, is the military, the veterans, and their families. So I don't want to lose sight of that, and also lose sight of the fact, and this is really more maybe an American perspective. Most American veterans are doing fairly well. Most of the military are doing fairly well. But this talk is going to talk about those who aren't doing fairly well, because those are the things that we want to address, because we want to make sure everybody does well from serving their country. Next slide. One of the things that I've given a lot of thought about and a lot of thinking about is what are those features that are common across all militaries, regardless of what nation you serve, regardless if it's an all-volunteer military, regardless if you have military conscription. What are those common elements? In the US, it's often the case that veterans will tell us when we speak to them and focus groups that they feel more connected with veterans from other militaries than they do other Americans who've never served in the military. So there's something about this military culture that creates this shared experience, even when it's transnational, even when it's in another military. And I think that this list, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the elements of the military culture that are common among almost every military. So, and the Ukrainians know this right now. It's their job is to fight and win their nation's wars. Every military has that as their overarching mission, not just fighting, but winning. And as we all know, the Ukrainians are in a fight for national survival. So this even ups the importance and significance of that. The United States hasn't been in a war where our national survival has been at stake for, one could argue, since World War II, and even then one could argue that's questionable. But the idea is when your national survival is at stake, the stakes are higher. But some of these common cultural elements, as we all know, the chain of command, the hierarchy, this informal set of rules, working together as a team is essential. And I'm going to emphasize in this particular lecture the role of the junior leaders in the unit. Their role is so fundamental to well-being and the climate and the culture that's created that can address some of these corrosives that I'm going to talk about. The collective socialism that exists in all the militaries, and by that I mean, if you're in the military, you have a job. Everybody's doing something in the military. Everyone is provided housing, medical care, all of these things that society may or may not provide are provided in every military, to include the United States, where we don't have a national healthcare system. In the military, it is a military healthcare system for every service member and their families. And importantly, every military, anyone who's ever served, has this unique identity around their military experience. The more positive their military experience is, the stronger the association of that military identity becomes. For those veterans who were in combat, they have this identity around what it means to be a combat veteran. So this identity is a very, very powerful aspect of the military culture, and it's an aspect that can be leveraged to build on both while individuals are serving, but often after they leave and become veterans, because they still will maintain that military identity. They're now a veteran. They could be a combat veteran, depending on what their role was. And we could even do a whole lecture on the importance and fundamentals of military identity. I just want to just say that, just keep in mind, military identity is not a single thing. There's been a lot of recent research on military identity showing that it's a multifaceted, multidimensional concept. There are aspects of military identity that it's good. There's aspects of it that aren't so good. Next slide. So I'm going to talk here about 4 or 5, very briefly. I'm going to briefly introduce them and probably skip over a lot of slides. But these are issues in the U.S. military that we're grappling with. So military sexual assaults, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender discrimination, racism in the military. Race is a very, very important topic broadly in the United States. I think it's taken on a bigger topic internationally with immigration, which can also be an important issue. And I should say that race, the way it's discussed in the U.S., it's not technically just race. It's also ethnic differences. And it could also be religious differences. So the way that race is used in the U.S., it's a very broader concept beyond the traditional race distinction. I only say that because the way I'm using it here, it's going to be very specific to African Americans, but I just want folks to understand there's these racial issues around ethnicity, particularly Hispanics, non-English speaking. So skin color is an important part of it, but ethnicity is also an important part of it. I'm also going to talk about military suicides just briefly, and then military and veteran radicalization, which is also not an emerging topic. It's an emerging topic from the sense that it's new, but I'll show you some slides historically that shows that military and veteran radicalization has very, very deep roots. And I think everyone in the world has heard of the organization in the United States called the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Their origin was military veterans after the Civil War. So again, this is not a new thing, but it's a new area that has gained increased focus. Next slide. Now, often when we talk about corrosives, I think it's important to, how do we have corrosives? How do they exist? What's the if you will, the cause? And it's like everything that's complex. There's multiple causes. This is in no way an exhaustive list, but I want to say that it's fundamentally corrosives occur because we do not treat each other with dignity and respect. Fundamentally, it's how we interact with other people that we don't do a good job of. And, you know, my new motto in life is work hard and be nice. So that's my life goal now, is just to work hard, which I've always done, but I haven't always been a nice person. So for myself, I'm trying to be a nice person, right? And in every context. And you realize that when you're a nice person, you feel better about yourself, and people don't mind if you're around if you're nice. But if you're not a nice person, people don't want you around, no matter how hard you work. So the idea is my motto in life now, and I've got, my wife actually bought me a plaque. I'm looking at it in my office. It says, work hard and be nice to others. Okay. So, or be kind. This one says be kind. It's the same concept. It's also, corrosives happen because leaders at the junior level, they fail to make on-the-spot corrections. So one of the things in the U.S. military and in all militaries is leaders are responsible for enforcing discipline and standards. And when leaders fail to correct racist comments, sexist comments, discriminatory comments, when they fail to do on-the-spot corrections with that, that allows the climate and a culture to be created that allows bullying and hazing and these other types of behaviors to emerge. And you know, I always say, every time you ignore a deficiency, you have set a new standard. Now, that sounds like I'm saying these on-spot corrections is not nice. It's not comfortable correcting people and telling them you're acting out, you're not doing the right thing. But you can do that in a way that's professional. You can do it in a way that's encouraging for them to do it. It also is this failure to embrace diversity of opinions and diversity of beliefs and diversity of thoughts without your own thoughts and your own beliefs feeling threatened. Okay. So it's okay not to agree with someone, but you can do that in a respectful way. You can do that treating the other person with dignity and respect. And then finally, I want to say organizations oftentimes don't set clear expectations or enforce clear standards of what is acceptable behavior. So as you can see, this is a multi-level. There's things that the individual service member is responsible for. There are things leaders need to be doing, and there are things that the organization needs to be doing. So this is not just all about the individual. It's not all about leaders. It's not all about the organizations. All three have got to be engaged in doing the right thing. Next slide. Now, what's the impact of corrosives? Who cares? Why can't I be racist? Why can't I be a sexist? Why can't I be intolerant to other ideas? Why can't I just do my own thing? Well, one, it lowers morale and disrupts cohesion. If I have a different belief or a different skin color and I'm excluded and you discriminate against me, then I'm not going to feel committed to you or the organization. I'll say, so it creates this distrust among the soldiers. I'm using the word soldiers very broadly to mean all service members here, and the leaders. And it then lowers the prestige of the military amongst civilians. So they not only will not themselves want to serve, they won't want their children serving in a military either that's intolerant, especially if they feel that they are different or they're not going to be accepted. And if you look at some of the groups that I mentioned, these are the groups that struggle with being accepted for who they are into the military organizations. Next slide. One of the things that I also want to highlight is corrosives don't self-correct. If there's not active intervention, they will continue. I already mentioned this point about everyone has a role to play, and everyone does have a role to play. And those roles need to be communicated clearly. This is your role to do this. However, at the same time, we mustn't overcorrect and make the correction worse than the problem we're solving. I think in medicine, they say the cure shouldn't be worse than the disease. right? So you don't kill someone while you're trying to cure them. That's not helpful. The idea is the cure is better than the disease. And also, fixing corrosives is not easy. If they were easy, they wouldn't be a problem. If we knew how to solve sexism and sexual assault in the U.S. military, we would have done it by now. If we knew how to fix the suicide problem, we would have done it by now. These are not easy problems to address, but we've got to address them anyway because they're fundamental to unit readiness, the ability to fight and win our nation's war. So the U.S. was very, very focused on these. Next slide. So now you're probably hopefully saying, well, what is a corrosive? What is your definition of a corrosive? Well, here it is, a simple definition. This actually I modified from the, I think I used the Webster dictionary, but you can use an Oxford dictionary if you think that's more impressive. I looked at a lot of different dictionary definitions, but it's basically having the quality of corroding or eating away harmful or destructive. So it's anything in your organization that can be harmful, destructive, deleterious, bad. You could put your own adjective on it. It's something you don't want to have happen. And it eats away. It's not this all one time. It does something. It's a constant eating away at the organization. Now, let me give you just some examples of why this is a problem in the U.S. And I'm going to start with suicides in the military. But next slide, please. And also just be thinking about suicides post-military service as well. Okay, next slide. When we talk about suicides, and I know that we've had several webinars already on suicides, so I know many of you are experts on this, but suicides are rare events. And I want to start here because if we don't acknowledge that they're rare, we may be thinking that every single person in the world is going to die by suicide, and that's not true. So first we have to overcome the human instinct to live. There's this basic human instinct that everybody wants to live. We must overcome religious and cultural barriers. There's a lot of religious barriers, cultural barriers that if you die by suicide, you can't be born in the church cemetery. There are cultural barriers around dying by suicide or telling anyone you had a family member who died by suicide. There's a stigma associated with that in many cultures. And I think these apply certainly to the U.S. We also mustn't forget humans are incredibly resilient, both physically and psychologically. You heard a couple of lectures by Dr. Rhonda Cornum, who talked about resilience and post-traumatic growth already. And Jim Martin, who also introduced and talked about this concept. So people are resilient. Okay, so I don't want us to lose sight of this when we talk about suicides, because we can leverage these as strengths. Plus, there's a lot of reasons to live. No matter how bad life gets, people find a reason to live. In fact, that's one of the majors we learned. One of the major interventions to preventing someone who's thinking about ending their life for living is to give them reasons to live, right? The Holt boxes that Dr. Jobs talked about in one of our webinar series. And there's this belief in an afterlife that makes the vast majority of current situations that are unpleasant bearable, because you know you're going to go somewhere at the end of your life that's a better place. In the Christianity, you're going to go to heaven, streets of gold, there's no suffering, everyone's going to be always in this euphoric state. So there are reasons to live. Next slide. And here I'm just going to go through these slides very quickly, and I hope that's okay. Next slide.
Thank you.
This is just data, again, from the U.S. that shows that there's an important difference between who dies by suicide. Men are more likely to die than women. Next slide. There's an important age component. Okay.
I have plenty of time. If you mail them to me, that would work out well.
So
thank you. I appreciate it.
When you look at the age of individuals who die, it's not the same. Next slide. And one of the things we do know in the U.S. is that murders are very common, very prolific, because we have access to guns and weapons. But now more people are dying by suicide than murder. So this is just to show you the magnitude of the problem in society. Next slide. This shows some of the data we have among veterans. And you can see that there's been this constant increase. This data stops at 2020, but I can assure you that it's about the same. We may have asymptoted a little bit, which is good news. It's not getting worse. We may have hit a ceiling effect that we say in research, but it's still a major problem. Next slide. This is suicides in veterans. And again, these are just raw numbers. Next slide. It looks like suicide rates may be coming down in terms of raw numbers, but that's also because the number of veterans who are alive are declining. So just keep that in mind, but it looks like we may have asymptoted and maybe seen some slight improvement. Next slide. And there's also this concept, suicide by proxy, that I just want to briefly touch on. And in the military, one can think about deliberately exposing yourself to enemy fire without trying to achieve a military objective. And there are lots of reports from previous wars, from Korea, Vietnam, World War II, where soldiers have done this. And so they may not kill themselves. They may try to get somebody else to kill them for them because they want to die, but they can't overcome these survival instincts, these religious and cultural barriers that I briefly touched on. Sometimes there's been reports that have been well documented in the US where people commit crimes in a manner where they get the police to shoot them. And this is called suicide by police proxy or police proxy shooting. Or we have some individuals who just engage in extreme risk-taking behavior around drugs, around alcohol use, around driving recklessly on motorcycles or in cars. So they engage in these reckless behaviors because they are hoping by doing so it will result in their death, because they don't have the barriers or the overcoming these barriers to actually die by suicide. Next slide. Now, in the U.S., active duty suicides have risen significantly over the past 3 or 4 decades, and they remain high. But like I said, it looks like they may have asymptoted. There is something important to point out in the U.S. and something to consider in the Ukrainian military. We know that there are 3 major points where suicides appear to increase the most, and that is when service members first join the military, when they return home from deployment, the first few months home from deployment, and when they leave the military to rejoin the civilian community. So I don't think I've ever presented it. I have a whole theory on military transition theory that talks about how these transition points are very critical. These aren't the only transition points, but these are the ones where we have the best data. And it shows that these transition points can be a big challenge. And so what I've been trying to do, unsuccessfully, I might add, for many, many years, is to get the military to focus on these transition points for their suicide prevention efforts, because we know that's where service members and veterans are the most vulnerable. So why not focus where they're the most vulnerable versus focusing across their lifetime? Next slide. So this is just some data. I'm not going to go over this. This is basically what I already said. I will point out on this slide, though, that, and we know this already from our lectures and webinars on suicide, although we have some treatments and intervention that are very, very promising, effective treatments for addressing all suicides remains elusive. So it's an area that does require much, much more work. And many of the prevention efforts also are not very well validated. Next slide. One of the things that we do, that I do want to touch on here, and this is this idea of combat and moral injury. I've given a much more detailed talk on this already, but this just reminds me that combat not only impacts one's mental and physical health, it also impacts their morality, the way they approach life, the way they think they should be treating others, especially prisoners of war. This is a huge issue, and once one commits a violation of a deeply held moral belief, as we know, this is our definition of a moral injury. Next slide. One of the things I think is important is that everyone has dark moments in their life. Probably everyone on this webinar has experienced a dark moment, either physically or existentially. This belief that some have that they would be better off dead than alive. Maybe they're different. This is one of the ideas of why suicide rates are much higher among LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, because they feel they're different. It's also one of the possible explanations for why people die by suicide who have a mental health issue, because of the stigma. People don't want to have a lifelong mental health disorder. There's this moral issue, the failure to uphold your moral beliefs, your moral standards. The social aspect, the feelings of being rejected. Then there's this insurmountable debt. We see a lot of suicides among people who have embezzled money, who have gotten into huge financial problems. And then criminal, right? You create criminal acts and you're going to go to jail, and rather than go to jail and have everyone think you're a criminal, because you don't maybe think, I'm not a criminal, I did this one thing, but that's not who I am. These are all dark moments that place people at incredible risk for dying by suicide. And I think acknowledging that these dark moments exist will help us develop more effective interventions and more effective prevention approaches. Next slide. So this is just a kind of a restatement in bulletized format of what I just said, and keeping in mind that people die by suicide for a variety of reasons. Hopefully that's what you took away from the last slide. Not everyone has a mental health issue who dies by suicide, and by far, many more people have mental health disorders than die by suicide. So these are not causal. Again, it's why it's this intractable approach, because there's so many variables impinging on it. Next slide. Now, one of the things that we have in the military specifically is this belief that all suicides are preventable. While that's admirable and ambitious, it's probably not accurate. Many suicides can be prevented, but not all. Again, I already mentioned this. There's this belief in the U.S. that all suicides involve mental or behavioral health issues. That's why they're sent to the behavioral health care providers, anyone who's suicidal. But I just showed you a whole list. People die for a variety of reasons, many of which have nothing to do with mental health issues. There's also this belief that all suicides are preceded by warning signs. I'm not sure if they're preceded by warning signs as much as they're preceded by these dark moments. All right, and some of them you can observe, some of them you can't observe. There's also this belief that all service members are at equal risk. Now, one could say, well, the military doesn't really think that, but they act that way based on how they do their interventions. They do their interventions for everyone the same way at the same time every year. That's treating everyone at their equal risk. Even though we know they're not at equal risk, we behave as if they're at equal risk versus these transition time points that I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes when suicides happen, leaders and other unit members fail to detect these warning signs, because in retrospect, you see a lot of things that you may not have paid attention to. And oftentimes leaders or buddies are blamed for the suicides for them not detecting the symptoms. And then behavioral personnel, there's also this belief that they know how to effectively treat and cure anyone who's suicidal. And of course, that's not true. If we did know how to do that, we would really really make a dent in suicides. Next slide. So this is just sort of a summary, if you will, that puts the current approach that our military has taken to suicide. Next slide, please. And how what I think taking a more stoic approach, and by stoic I don't mean stoic in the sense that you don't show emotions, you don't tell people how you're feeling, this British stiff upper lip type of stoicism. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm sorry for picking on the British. I love the British. But it's not trying to be macho in a situation where probably showing some emotions is more appropriate. But the Stoic approach would take a strength-based approach. It would build character. It would focus on building character. It values life with honor. This is a fundamental Stoic philosophy that the way you live a good life, a whole life, the best life is by living a virtuous life. So it really is focused on treating others with dignity and respect. This should sort of sound familiar. It emphasizes skill development and cohesion, and it's focused on, is it working? So I'm not going to go over the current model. I already sort of highlighted those aspects of that. But, one approach is focused on building individual strength, building teams, developing good leaders. The other approach is really waiting for something to happen and responding to it. So trying to get out in front of it. Next step, or next slide. So the next slide basically shows that we need to develop validated interventions. I've already hit that point home. But we need to remain patient, but not complacent. It's going to take time to work through and get evidence-based approaches. So we need to be patient, but not complacent, if that makes sense. Next slide. Sexual assaults, military sexual assaults has been a problem in the U.S. military, I will dare say forever. All right, but it's obviously not been forever because America hasn't been around forever. But it's been a major problem going as far back as we have data to World War II. And it continues to be a major problem. And it continues to be a major focus that the military is trying to address. It's one of those pervasive threats to readiness that we continue to grapple with. And I just want to say also that it's not unique to the U.S. military. I mentioned earlier a lot of NATO groups, a lot of NATO activities focused on a lot of behavioral health issues. One of those issues that just completed, led by Dr. Sanella Durson from Canada, has highlighted how pervasive military sexual assaults are within NATO. And there are many countries who thought, oh, this is not a problem. When I was interested in looking at this topic about 15 years ago, I was told by Canada as an example, oh, we don't have a problem. This is a uniquely American problem. Okay, so so they were dismissing. It turns out it's a major problem in Canada, and many generals and admirals in the Canadian military, if you just Google Canada generals fired, you're going to get like 8 or 9 generals and admirals have been in the last 4 or 5 years fired for sexual misconduct, for covering things up. So it was a massive problem. And the courage that Canadian women veterans and service members coming forward and telling their stories is just been amazing to witness. But you recognize how long that suffering has been. Next slide. This is just to show lots of different reports in the U.S. showing how damaging it is, but really to highlight that the military has not stopped on this. This is a problem that they are trying to grapple with. Next slide. This slide here, I just want to highlight, if you look at the light blue on the right, civ means civilian versus military. My point I want to make here is that military sexual assaults in the U.S. is a major, major problem. It's also a major, major problem among civilians too. This is not to minimize the problem that exists in the military. nor to minimize the responsibility the military has for solving the problem. But I want to highlight that this is a cultural issue of how women are treated. And I don't think America is unique. I think this pattern would be seen in every country in the world if we could get good data. Next slide. This is just some data from a study that I collected. The only point that I want to make here for you is, one, you'll be able to look at this, but we might be making some progress. We might be making some progress, but we still have a lot of work to do. Okay, we still have a lot of work to do. So you never rest easy when you see things like this, because the amount of suffering and the amount of harm that's done to women and men who've been sexually assaulted is tremendous. Now, I haven't talked a lot about male sexual assault. It happens, it occurs, it's unpleasant. People don't like to talk about it. Commanders don't want to think that they have their combat veterans who are engaging in this kind of behavior, but they are, and it does need to be addressed. Next slide. Certainly from the U.S. side. Again, I just want to highlight a couple things, again, around transition. And so this next slide, basically in bullet, we know from our data, so the U.S. military collects wonderful data on this problem, which part of it is, what's the nature of the problem? Can we quantify it, measure it? That 85% of sexual assaults among women service members in the U.S. occur within the first 2 years of military service. So think about that. They're not at all at equal risk all the time. It's during this first transition point. See, I'm trying to make this point about transitions. It's how people transition in, and you think about the transition process. They don't know anyone. They don't know who to trust. They may trust the wrong person, etc. So this is just my point about emphasizing that transitions are extremely vulnerable times for certain people. They're also times for growth and enhancement and opportunities. But, you know, the flip side of that is they can also make people vulnerable. And this is where interventions are probably best targeted. So I've been pushing this for over a decade now unsuccessfully, but I'm not going to stop, because we know when they're happening. That's where all of our resources should be going to prevent them. Now, not all of them, right? There's 15, 20% that occur at some other point. So we need to cover down on that too. But the vast majority of our resources needs to be focused on this first 2 years of the transition. Next slide. So I'm going to just quickly talk about racism. Next slide. So racism is not a new issue. Many of you, I don't know if you follow this, a lot of the our military, primarily Army installations, were named after Confederate war generals, and we now renamed them all. You know, and the idea of, why are we naming our military installations after people who fought a war with other Americans to maintain slavery? You know, why would we do that? So they've all been renamed now. That's been done. We've banned the display of Confederate symbols, which emphasize slavery and white supremacy, and you still see that today. Many white supremacist organizations still display these kinds of flag. They're now prohibited in the U.S. military. And we also notice that African Americans are often underrepresented in promotions. The military has done a much better job recently, I mean the last 20 or 30 years, but there's still this general failure to accept everyone to accept African Americans as equals. So we've got work to do. This is the racial issue. I mentioned there are other issues as well around ethnicity, and I don't want to minimize that, but the real focus has been most recently on African Americans. Next slide. So it's recently been accepted that radicalization can and may be a problem. It's become highly political in the United States on whether or not being radicalized just means you on the conservative end of the political spectrum, or way on the other end, in the sort of radical progressive end, right? Because both of these ends of the spectrum have many similarities, but it tends to be in the United States versus in other European countries. It's the more totalitarian authoritarians that engage in violence. This is not true worldwide. In some nations, it's the other group that becomes very violent. So we have to think about this in a much broader global context. But in the U.S., it tends to be the more authoritarian side of the spectrum that engages in radicalization. Next slide. The most important thing here to really highlight is that radicalization is a very, very rare event. It's like 50, I calculated this one, I want to say 20 to 30,000 times rarer than suicides. So it's a very, very rare event, but when the event happens, it can be catastrophic. Think about January 6th, insurrection on the Capitol in the United States. Okay? That was a very, very significant event. It's happened one time in 250 years of Americans' existence. But that one event can really change the course of a nation. So yes, it's rare, but when it happens, it can be catastrophic in some cases. Next slide. One of the things that we do know in this slide is trying to capture it a little bit, is that early work on mass shootings shows that the active duty military and the veteran population is overrepresented. Okay, so they're overrepresented. So there's something going on about being in the military, having military service, that makes one susceptible. Next slide. I mentioned at the beginning that we have a lot of historical markers for radicalization in America. Next slide. Or are we out of slides? Oh, okay. Well, there's no slides on the one. That was the one where I was going to talk about the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan that emerged after the Civil War. We had the Friends of New Germany after World War I. We had the American Nazi Party during World War II and after World War II. We had the Oklahoma City bombing after the first Gulf War. And then we had Fort Hood shooting, the Unite the Right rally after Operation Iraqi Freedom, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This slide here simply shows some work that we've been doing, looking at how can we get in front of this? How can we inculcate honor and decency in our service members while they're serving, so when they leave the military, they're less susceptible to being recruited by these groups. So next slide. So this slide here just highlights some of these potential threats. There was extreme anger among many on active duty and veterans about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. To put it mildly, it was a disaster. We all saw it on TV. We saw Marines die through an explosion. So, this leaves a bitter taste in many veterans' system, in their mouth, about how we did that. And so this idea of how can folks who served in that conflict still look back on their time with honor and respect, and with the feeling that their service mattered and it meant something, that their colleagues, their buddies, fellow unit members who died, it wasn't for nothing. Okay, so we've got a lot of work to do in that space. And then, of course, we saw a lot of protesting around the COVID vaccination. And of course, we know in the military, at least in the U.S. military, we have a very, very rich history of vaccination. One of the very first vaccination efforts actually ever was issued by George Washington during America's fight for independence, where soldiers were vaccinated against smallpox, and mandated, by the way, with very little science, I might add, but highly, highly effective. And And of course, we continued to do that. I was a previous enlisted soldier myself before I became a commissioned officer. And I remember standing in line, I call it the gauntlet, where there's literally a line of medics, about 6 of them, 3 on each side, and you stood up in 2 shots, step forward, 2 more shots, step forward, 2 more shots. And then at the very end, there'd be a medic who'd handed you a polio sweet pill, so a little bit of sugar at the end of all of those shots. And I call it the gauntlet. And people have challenged, oh, they didn't do it that way. I've got photos. I should put a photo here. I can show you. The gauntlet existed when I was there, and it still exists today. And so you still get all of these shots, in a very efficient way. The military way, we got to vaccinate, we're going to do it very, very quickly. Next slide. This is the last topic I'm going to touch on, and that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. It used to be illegal to serve in the military if you were LGBT. So if you were an LGBT service member or an individual, you couldn't serve. And next slide. One of the compromises of that policy was, well, if you can serve if you're a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender individual, you just can't tell anyone. So this was the old don't ask, don't tell policy. So you could have a different sexual orientation, you could have a different sexual identity, but if you had that and you told anyone, then you would be kicked out of the military. And not just kicked out, you would be dishonorably discharged from the military. So your service was unacceptable. Of course, as we all know, that's been repealed, right? By executive order, and Congress repealed that and is now allowing LGB service members to serve, and they have served. But under the last president, transgender service members could not serve. Now they can serve. So I think we've settled now that LGB individuals can serve in the military, but the transgender service member status is in flux. It's in flux. Most NATO countries have a very open and inclusive policy around LGBT service members being allowed to serve. But we mustn't kid ourselves that there is a difference in how they are viewed and accepted. So what happens by policy isn't always what happens in translation down to how we treat each other. Again, treating people with dignity and respect is really important. Next slide. One of the things that we have been looking at, so this is the theory that myself and Jeremy Goldbach, who's now a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, put together. We call it the perpetrator hypothesis, and it's really an expansion of a lot of work that other people have done. This is just to remind everyone, this is a complicated issue too, because how I think about another person and what I think other people do, this is the judgment piece, right? And we always say, look, as behavioral health care providers, we need to back away from judging, and we need to be humble, right? Just because I wouldn't do a certain thing or engage in a certain behavior, that doesn't mean that the behavior is fundamentally wrong and that it should be prohibited. But oftentimes we make these judgments. And as behavioral health care providers, judging your clients is one of the worst things you can do in terms of helping them deal with a mental health issue or family issue or behavioral health issue. Next slide. One of the things that we have been doing for some time is, okay, we don't have this policy, but are LGBT service members still equally accepted? And so we have been looking at things like bullying and hazing. You could just go next slide. These are just how we define hazing and bullying from a U.S. perspective. I don't know if these definitions would be equally valuable to Ukrainians, but I think the behaviors that we're talking about are the same, and that is, it's an abuse of authority. Usually, it's not treating people with dignity and respect. It's making them do unpleasant things, really for the gratification of the person making you do them. or making the individual do them. Next slide. This is just some data showing that when you look at bullying as an example of this, is that non-LGBT service members report bullying too, by the way, almost at the same rate as LBG. So you can see that this, you know, one way of being accepted is, do we treat each other equally bad, right? I know that's said negative. We joke about that, you know, I hate everyone. I treat everybody terrible, right? That kind of thing. I don't discriminate. I treat everybody badly. Well, I would argue don't discriminate, treat everybody good. But, you know, the joke is I treat everybody bad. But you can see here that transgender service members, and this is a study that included all the military services, they report almost a 60, 70% higher incidence of bullying, hazing as well. And so we've got a lot of work to do in the U.S. Bullying, by the way, is a ubiquitous behavior across all militaries that I'm familiar with. Any military I've gone to, I've asked them about it. They all say it happens all the time, and hazing, by the way. So this is not a unique, I can say with great confidence, this is not a unique military challenge. This is a global military challenge. My guess is it's a global challenge among civilians too. We know bullying happens in the workplace. In many organizations, again, this is where behaviors of junior leaders, one, they've got to stop themselves from engaging in bullying, hazing, and they got to put a stop to it when they see it. So again, this is a junior leadership issue. Next slide. The only thing I want to say here, because I've already said most of these points, is transgender service members really do face a unique challenge of being accepted in the U.S. military. I don't know how pervasive this is in other militaries, nor would I speculate, but I know in the U.S. military, it's a challenge. The U.S. military, again, is working on addressing this challenge, but we haven't solved it. We haven't solved it by any means. So it's one of those unpleasant things that we try to grapple with. Next slide. So, you know, you always want to have a take-home message. My main one is corrosives, whatever they might be. And by the way, remember I said this list was not exhaustive. This isn't the only challenges we have. And it's not the only challenges that we've had historically. But we have to address them before they become so intractable we can't solve them. You know, historically, for example, in Vietnam, we had folks who were drafted. We had a draft. It was not an all-volunteer military at the time. We had folks flee to Canada to avoid serving in the military. And President Carter in the 70s gave everyone an amnesty. He basically granted an amnesty to all of those folks who fled to other countries around the world who didn't serve in the military. And I will tell you, at the time, I remember I was in high school. I was 16, 17 years old when it happened. Veteran groups were furious with President Carter for doing that. I was talking about this topic just yesterday in a class that I teach with veterans, and they were furious. They weren't even born yet when this law was passed. So people feel very strongly about if you're called, you serve. It still is this very tough conversation to have. And we don't talk about it anymore because it's kind of water under the bridge. But if you bring up the topic, it really brings out emotions and very strong opinions. So corrosives are best addressed early and not allowed to fester, right? And really have those conversations. Dignity and respect are still the touchstone of good leadership and unit cohesion. If you don't respect me, if you don't treat me right, I'm not going to be supportive of you. This is a basic value. Every military talks about treating others with dignity and respect. I said on many NATO panels, as I mentioned, I'm not aware of any nation that in the military who doesn't think that treating fellow members, treating other people with dignity and respect is a bad thing. they all say not only is it a good thing, we have it as one of our core values. Every military service now in the U.S., Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, even the Space Forces, has treating others with dignity and respect as one of their central service values. And we need to build on that and really articulate what does that mean. How we treat each other matters. I think this is so obvious, but I feel the need to say it. What I say to you, how I say it to you, the tone I use. My mother always would say when I'd raise my voice, don't you speak to me in that tone, right? Because how you speak to people shows how much respect you have for them, okay? Shows how much respect you have for them. And not treating each other with dignity and respect disrupts military readiness, and it impacts mental health. I think I showed you a slide before when we looked at good leadership in combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, that it was those leaders who were evaluated by their subordinates as a good leader were much more protected against the adverse effects of combat and the rigor of combat than those who reported bad leaders. In fact, bad leaders exacerbated the symptoms associated with PTSD, anxiety, and other mental health issues. So that's my presentation. I hope you found it useful, and I think I finished on time, which is actually unusual for me. So I hope I didn't go too fast, but the slides are available. I'm available. Here's my email. Please feel free to email me anytime if you have questions or if you want to get a copy. I think, well, Oksana has a copy of this, so she can certainly distribute it to anyone who would want it, but I'm also happy to do that. So I'd like to open it up for questions or reactions or comments and how you think this might apply in the Ukrainian context and what other issues you might have. Like I said, there are many other issues in the U.S. as well. I've just highlighted 5. I could have highlighted 10. I could have highlighted 2 or 3. But we got to start somewhere on the ones that affect the most people, so to speak. So I'll stop there, and we can, I think, stop the slide sharing and just open it up for questions or comments. I haven't been following anything in chat, but it doesn't look like we have any chat questions. But anyway, thank you all very much. I hope you found it useful.
Так. Можна я перед тим, як перейдемо до учасників,
Before we start with the participants, Oksana asked me to pass a question and comment about the realities that our army is facing and the realities of psychologists' work in our army. It's a rather big comment. I will try to read it quickly and to make it as clear as possible. So, quote, I am thinking about psychologists' work in the army as a fake job. Very often we see that people are coming for help without understanding what they want. They want us to do something to make them feel better, to make their situation better. Let's imagine that the system works in a way that psychologists are in subordination of the person who is asking for help. A psychologist is subordinated to the commander, and the commander says, do something to make the situation better. And this is a conflict. Do you think our people can participate in a conflict? Why our girl psychologists that we know who served in the army, they are disenchanted. They say that they are ready to give help, but not in the army. All the system is used to make appearance. For example, we have a victorious person's speech that we have to use at 7 o'clock in the morning. Just imagine people over 50s with hypertonia, with rheumatism, they can't move correctly. They can't just move, and they have to make this victory speech. And this was suggested by the psychologists. And when I doubt it, they tell me that I have to find something in my heart. So my unit refused to do the task. they sent 3 young girls who were talking to them for 3 hours. They sort of went there and did everything, but nobody said that the unit didn't have the necessary weapons. They don't have the anti-battery work, that the bribes ruined the trust to the commanders. And then the psychologists have to rectify the situation. And the psychologists have to say, yes, we are going to do this. And when my colleague said that this is a fake job to the commander, he changed his job. I think that a lot of measures are fake when we say one thing and we mean another thing, and we think about the third thing. This is a problem of the postmodern society when the boundaries are diluted, but this is a post-Soviet inheritance that we have when the truth is dangerous and we swim in the ocean of lies that have to do with everything. People don't trust in the high-ranking commanders, and this is like a reaction of children whose parents are lying every time, who are stealing things, and so on. And we have to talk with them about some values, and we are also adding some principle to this. The commander is always right, and if he is not right, look at the point number 1. So this is a comment, and maybe you can respond to this in some way.
Who was that? Was that Oksana's question?
Ну, Оксана передала від...
Oh, a different
Oksana
Oksana.
passed
A different
this from
Oksana. I was
another.
thinking it was Oksana Bayer. So that's you know, that is such a great question, and it really wasn't a question as much as it was like 9 or 10 questions. And so if I might, I'll just respond sort of 3 ways. There are 3 things I want to say to that response, and it's not necessarily in the order in which the comment was made, but it was a beautiful comment because it gets at the issue of the role of the leader, and the role of the leader in facing unpleasant facts. So I've written papers on leadership, and maybe I should give a webinar on how Americans approach to leadership, or how I think they should approach it, maybe say it that way. But being a leader, one, is really, really hard. It's really hard. And I don't think that we should minimize how difficult it is to be a good leader. Being a good leader is a really, really difficult task. Advising a leader as a psychologist or a behavioral healthcare worker, whether you're a psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker, or chaplain, even. Advising a leader who's engaged in bad behavior is also hard, okay? So being a good leader is hard, and advising a leader to do things differently is hard. And most people don't like criticism that's negative. We all like to be told how great we are. Like, you know, I would love to hear like nice comments about how everyone enjoyed my presentation, but I probably wouldn't enjoy so much those comments that said lousy job, you know, blah, 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 right? So we want positive feedback. So I think we need to spend more time as an organization developing our junior leaders specifically to accept feedback and not feel threatened by the feedback. So we oftentimes feel threatened when we're criticized, right? Because I didn't do something right, I did something wrong. And usually most feedback you get is negative, right? It is negative because people want you to be better. They want you to do better. It's in everybody's interest for leaders to do a good job. Nobody wants a leader to do a bad job. Everybody wants a leader to do a good job. So I think we have to recognize that, and we have to spend resources at the organizational level. Remember when I talked about these corrosives, I said the organization has to set clear expectations of what they expect, and they need to develop leaders. They need to put resources behind developing leaders. You don't just say, okay, you're now the leader. One day you're a follower, the next day you're a leader, and then expect good outcomes from that. You're going to get good leaders randomly. It's going to be a normal distribution, right? I'm a big believer in the normal distribution. You're going to have really good leaders, really toxic leaders, and then so-so leaders in the middle, which is where most of us are, right? Most of us are so-so leaders. But organizations can develop leaders, and they can develop leader behaviors, things that they concretely tell leaders, here's what to do. Here are things not to do. More often than not, people remember the bad things leaders do, not the good things. I think sort of there's this general leader principle, management principle, that 90% of the people remember the negative things about a leader. And there are very few positive things, okay? Because we don't spend enough time on our junior leaders. And here I'm talking the non-commissioned officers, the brand new lieutenants. We need to, captains, we need to spend more resources developing them before we throw them in leadership positions and then hope they do well, okay? So that's the organizational role. At the individual level, and I will tell you as a psychologist, I cannot tell you the number of times when I would be talking to soldiers, they would want me to intervene and get their leader replaced or fired. That's not what was said in the comment, but that's what was going through my mind is soldiers are looking to psychologists and mental health. Our leader is bad. Can you get, no, I cannot get your leader fired or reassigned, nor would I do that anyway. Okay, even if I could, unless they were doing some criminal behavior or something like that, then I'm obligated as an officer to intervene. But the point here is I asked them at the soldier level, what have you done to help your leader become a better leader? What things have you done to make them more effective? Now, they usually don't think like that because they're thinking what my leader needs to do differently, not what I need to do differently. But you have to think at your level, what could you do differently to make your leader better or keep your leader out of trouble? Because when a leader sees a subordinate working in their interest, then their interest is going to become their subordinate's interest as well. Okay, so things the organization can do in leader development, things that the subordinates can do. The leaders themselves, remember I said there's 3 levels. I wanted to start the top and the bottom. Now, the leader themselves, as part of maturing, need to be open to negative feedback. And negative feedback is not good, right? No one wants negative feedback, but you've got to create a climate and a culture where people can come to you and say, sir, do you realize this is what you're doing and how it's being perceived? Or ma'am, this is what you're doing. This is how it's being perceived. So leaders themselves need to be more open and feel less threatened. That's probably the hardest bit to do. Okay, that's probably the hardest bit to do. It's easier for a subordinate to just work hard. Okay, my leader's not doing this. It needs to be done. Let me take care of it. So, it's easy for organizations to say, okay, let's put in some leader things, relatively speaking. It's much harder to take negative feedback. I mean, just think about, for those of you who have partners, you want to be a good partner. I want to be a good husband. How do I know if I'm being a good husband? How do I know? Well, I just know I am because I'm a good person. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a good person. No, you ask your wife, how am I doing? And then are you ready for the answer you're going to get? Are you ready for the honest feedback? Now, I'm blessed. I have a wife who gives me feedback unsolicited. So I don't need to ask her how I'm doing. She'll tell me how I'm doing. Okay. But what you want as a leader is you want to open up the apertures where you can have trusted people. And trust is the important part here. A lot of times in the U.S. military, and I've heard this in other countries too. I don't know if this is a true description of it happens in the Ukrainian military, but we have this saying: leader trust, respect is earned. How many of you do you have that saying in the Ukrainian military that respect is earned? As an individual, I will respect you, but you have to earn my trust. You have to earn your respect. I respect your rank, I respect your position, but I don't respect you as a person. As a person, respect is earned. What I'm saying is respect is something you should always show people. And respect is two ways. Subordinates also have to earn the respect of their leaders. They think it's just a one way. In the US, we talk about it as a one way. Leaders have to earn respect. They have to earn my trust. But that applies down too. Leaders have to, can I respect you? Subordinates respect and trust needs to be earned as well. It's a reciprocal relationship. I think you've heard me say before, relationships are the fundamentals of cohesion and good leadership. It's the trust and the bond that you have. To know that when I'm making a critique, it's because I love you and I want us to be stronger, not because I'm trying to weaken you and make you look bad. This is the trust aspect. It's hard to do. I'm not minimizing that. If, like I said, if this was easy, we would have already done it. Okay, so that's the second point I want to make. The third thing on this beautiful response is the double standards. I heard double standards. I don't know if you have that phrase in the Ukrainian military. You know, we make rules that subordinates follow, but leaders don't intend to follow them. That's just bad leadership. You should never have a rule that everyone isn't going to follow, pure and simple. And if leaders don't want to follow a particular rule, then they shouldn't have the rule, period, full stop. So this is a basic leadership principle in the US, that rules apply to everyone equally. Okay, so this again is a hard concept because a lot of people think, oh, if I'm more senior, I don't have to follow half the rules, but everybody else has to follow them. That's the privilege of being a leader, is I don't have to follow rules. No, it's not. The privilege of leadership is that you get to lead. That's the privilege. And you get paid hopefully a little bit more. Not a lot more, but you get paid a little bit more. But leadership isn't about getting to do things. You know, you earn privileges, but with that privilege comes increased responsibility, right? You don't just get privileges, you also have more responsibility as you become more senior. And sometimes we do a bad job in our leader development courses, certainly in the United States, of emphasizing that point. As you move up, you get more privileges. Rank does have privilege. Rank should have privileges, okay? Rank should have privileges. I'm a very big believer in that because you earn rank. So it's an earned privilege. You could figure out, each nation figures out what those privileges are. But also with those privileges is increasing responsibility. And sometimes leaders forget that. They want the privilege, but not the responsibility. And they go hand in hand. The more privilege, the more responsibilities. So I'll just stop there because I could go on and on about leadership, because this fundamentally is a leadership issue. And maybe we should have some of our next webinar series on this topic. But thank you so much for the comment. And I'm sorry I took so long to answer it. I see Ola's hand is up. Hopefully he's going to say something nice to me and make me feel comfortable.
Так, давайте будемо по
Okay,
черзі.
let us go one by one. One live comment and one text comment. Please, Oleg, the floor is yours, and then I will read a comment from the chat.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's always wonderful to hear from you and learn from you. I have two questions. I will try to ask them fast. So first question, do you think that military, like national military culture, is representation of national corporate culture? Some national features, for example, while being in United States, I got this impression about it's very normal, very, let's say, expected, even expected behavior to be open in communication and sharing even some personal information, even when you are introduced to each other. So you have this, I would say, compared to my national culture, you have very high level of openness in communication. So it's one question. And second question, how much national American military culture has been changed after you start applying after action reviews after Second World War? because I think it's a great instrument. And when you were mentioning about feedback from the, let's say, military personnel to the leaders, it's easy to do through after-action reviews, but it's still not well implemented practice in our army. Even it's a, let's say, obligatory since 2018, but because we have so big fast growing culture, a lot of people are civilians, and even old military officer, they are not very well, they don't feel comfortable, I think, with this instrument, because like you mentioned, you need to be open for criticism, and you have to accept, and you have to share your own let's say failures and mistakes maybe in order to make next actions better. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Ola, for those two great questions. So communication style is going to be absolutely driven culturally. And I will just say also that communication styles just in the U.S. military in all the various services is different. So the Navy is a much more traditional, conservative style of communication. And probably the Army is sort of the most, in some ways, open style communication, where, you know, much more swearing, much more sort of candid, in your face type, you F this up, what were you thinking kind of statements, right? And of course, you know, you're, oh my God, you know, you're traumatized in some ways because of the language used, the aggressive nature of the language. But I will assure you, there's no aggression generally intended. Okay, it can be perceived as aggressive,
like brutality. Yeah,
a good friend of mine, you know, we go back and forth all the time, and people think we hate each other. We are like this, but people's because that's how you talk to each other in the Army. He's not offended, I'm not offended, but also, oh my God, they're traumatized, right? So there is sometimes this difference, but there's also this corporateness structure to the military where you hold things close, right, to outsiders. So if you're an outsider, I will moderate what I say. I won't be as candid until I feel I can trust you, okay? Until I feel I can trust you. Now, that happens much more quickly when you say, oh, I'm in the military. Oh, so we're almost going to have this instant bonding because you've served, you're serving, I've served. We have this shared bond. This thing I mentioned earlier, where many Americans, and I don't know how, if it's reciprocated, but many American veterans will say, I have more in common with people from other countries who served in the military than I do with those Americans who've never served. Serving in the military creates this instant shared experience that veterans appreciate, military veterans appreciate. And that helps with the communication and how, like, we would talk to you in your visit versus if someone came over who had never served and weren't even interested in the military, then they'd wouldn't be as open and wouldn't be as inclusive. Okay. So I think it's a really important cultural thing we don't really understand. There hasn't been a lot of cross-cultural national studies like this done. I'm giving you sort of my anecdotal personal experiences meandering around the globe, but that's what I observe. I observe this sort of this immediate shared experience. And now I'm blanking on what your second question was, Ola, about one was communication and one was, what was the other
About after action reviews,
Oh yes, how they're
military culture
yeah.
has been changed after you start
So
implementing this.
after action reviews are hit and miss because some after action reviews are check the box. In the US, you have to do after action reviews and they become a check the box. People do get defensive because they feel you're criticizing them versus criticizing what happened, right? And so oftentimes it's taken personally when it's not intended to be personal. So one of the things I always tell people, try not to take things personally. Now, very early on, I developed this approach that I don't take things personally, even when they're intended to be personal. I don't take them personally because one, they don't know me enough to personally attack me. I know that cognitively. And then second, are the criticisms valid? And can we kind of step back and say, yeah, this was a good point. But, you know, that takes experience, right? You have to have a level of experience and self-confidence to take this kind of criticism, right? To take negative criticism without taking it personally. We're human beings. We're going to process things from a personal lens as well. And to the extent that we can say, is the point, I get they're attacking me, but is there any validity to the points? Can we do that honest assessment? And sometimes that's useful to have a close colleague, a close friend that you trust who can kind of level with you, right? Say, look, yeah, you screwed that up, dude. What were you thinking? And you say, man, I don't know what I was thinking, right? And you get those kinds of responses, and those are healthy. So if you know that you're not a person that likes negative feedback, develop a relationship with someone who can give you honest feedback, you know, can really tell you how it is. Doesn't mean you're going to change, but at least you've heard it through someone you trust, right? And that's step one. All right. Step one is getting the honest feedback from a source that you trust. Because if someone tells me that I did something wrong and I don't like them or I don't trust them, I'm not even going to listen to what they're saying. But if it's someone who I trust, who I respect, giving me that feedback, then at least I'm going to listen. So if you first got to hear it, and then maybe you'll change. But after action reviews aren't going to always result in an immediate change, right? Well, but there are things that do, right? We've got loads and loads of historical documents from World War II and Vietnam where things have changed in like how we train, right? And I'm looking over here, I've got a whole shelf of leadership books. There's a leadership book that came out. It was a Department of Defense leadership book for all officers. So this was like a tri-service. We only had 3 services. The Navy or the Marines are part of the Navy. And in this leadership book, it laid out key leadership principles that was written in I want to say 1953 for some reason. I will tell you that to me is the Bible. It's about this thick. It's a very thin leadership book. And every principle in there is still valid today. And it's nearly 75 years old. And it's a gem. Now, each service now has their own leadership manual, and people confuse leadership with management, right? So this book is a leadership book. It's not a management book. It's not, here's how's a counseling form, how's how to complete the counseling form. That stuff doesn't belong in leadership manuals, right? That's a leader management book. That's not a leadership book. But I don't know if it's still in press. I bought several copies. I give them out because I buy them at used bookstores. And I say, look, this is a gem. If you want to understand military leadership or be a good leader, read this. And it's very well written. You know, this is at an era when people were better writers and tighter thinkers. So, you know, I've got my own biases about how people think and write now. But this leadership book, it's called the Blue Manual. It's because it's published in a blue book. It's fabulous. If I can get a copy of it, I'll pick one up for you and give it to you. This one maybe we should translate because it is an absolute gem, and the leadership principles are transnational. They're transnational. They apply to the military. They apply to civilians. They apply to how you run your family. They're really good. It doesn't mean you're going to do them all because they're hard to do, right? If leadership was so easy, we wouldn't even be talking about it as a topic because it would be a non-issue. Being a good leader. Remember I said this earlier. is really, really hard. It takes a lifetime of work and study and self-reflection. Did I do this right? Could I have done it better? Right? And without beating myself up over it, right? This is, the psychologist in me. Learn, let it go, and move on, right? You can't be dwelling on things that have already happened, or brains would just shut down. So, but these are two great issues. Learning, but you have to conduct the after action reviews if you expect change. People have got to at least go through the process and then eventually internalize it. And then you can learn. But treating people with dignity and respect is really important in the after action process, where you're not belittling and being needlessly mean. You're sticking to the facts. It's to be everybody better. This is not a critique of you. This is what we can do better next time, right? That's got to be the focus, not a critique of individuals, but a critique of how we can do things better the next time. That's how you learn from after action reviews, not by attacking individuals and belittling people and making them feel their contribution was minimal or all messed up, right? That's not what you do. That's a bad after action review, because then everybody just shuts down and stops saying anything, right? Or, we have a thing among officers that you don't drop a dime, right? We say drop a dime because this is when telephone calls, you put a dime in the slot machine and you turn somebody in. You don't dime people out or embarrass them publicly. Like if you and I are friends and you're giving a talk, I'm not going to ask you a tough question that puts you on the spot, right? That's right. Friends don't do that to friends, right? They may be offline, or they'll throw you a softball where you can, hit it out of the park kind of thing, make you look smart. That's what friends do. Friends don't ask tough questions to put you on the spot and embarrass you, right? So, but after action reviews sometimes have to be this sort of candid, this feedback may hurt, but we screwed this up, right? I mentioned earlier the withdrawal from Afghanistan, disaster, right? There are after action reviews. What could have gone better? What did we screw up? There are a lot of places where improvement could happen. You got to have those, though. You've got to be honest with yourself as an organization, right? That means you're a learning organization. You learn from your mistakes. You don't just continue to repeat them. So I'll stop there. I know, again, I gave a very long-winded, and I see we're also out of time. I don't know, Anton, if we have time for one more question or if you want to put a stop to it. It's up to you.
Так, давайте я тоді з чату запитання.
Yes, I will then get a question from the chat, the one that was written here first. It's a half comment, half question from Mikhailo Kotsupinski. What do we do with our subordinates if they refuse to do a task or to go on a mission that involves risk to life? So I have a mission, I have people, and there is me. I have to prepare them for the mission. But we live in different cultural communities and environments. A lot of things that we learn from others, they don't necessarily work with us. So we just go and do our thing.
Well, so this is a really difficult question, right? Because it's about leader in situations that can result in someone being killed. All right. And that's fundamentally what combat is, right? This is again another lecture, but that's why it's called war, is because people die. If people weren't dying, they wouldn't call it war. They call it something else. Peacekeeping, peace support. Have a different name, right? And oftentimes we don't talk about killing. We don't talk about dying. We don't talk about being severely wounded. We don't talk about the suffering that happens. We don't talk about the aftermath of the suffering of families and friends and communities. So we don't really sometimes have these honest conversations, because dying and killing people are unpleasant conversations to have, right? Psychologically, culturally, we don't like to talk about them. Not talking about them doesn't make the problem go away, that's what's happening, Okay, it doesn't change the dynamics. It's this undercurrent, right? It's this undercurrent of what's happening. And we all want to think that after every war that everyone is going to come home safe and sound. But they're not. That's the reality. Those are the facts, right? Those are the facts. And talking about those facts and internalizing those facts and understanding what all of those facts mean is fundamental to sustaining soldiers in combat. They're fundamental. I'm thinking that needs to be a topic of this webinar series. And not that I'm going to provide the answers, because I don't have the answer to that question, but I know the context and the foundation that has to be set in order to begin addressing that problem and that challenge, because it's a problem and it is a challenge and it needs a solution. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm not doing that. I'm going to get killed if I do that. I'm not going, I'm not going, I'm not going. And then they end up going. Okay. This happened in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. We've never written about this, but I have lots of, I'm not going to call them anecdotes, although in some ways they're anecdotes because they're stories, but I have so many stories that it's really more of a collection of experiences that I think we can draw lessons learned from, if that makes sense. So I don't know what we call that scientifically. I'll let the scientist, I'm in a science, but what do you call that? Is that it's not a qualitative study? It's a pattern of findings. It's a collection of anecdotes. I don't know, but I think it's more than just an anecdote. I think it's I've spoken to enough people about this, and I could tell you lots and lots of these stories, but time doesn't permit. But I think it's a separate topic that we should have. It's a real important question, but you've got to set and have the honest conversation about what you're asking soldiers to do and what they're risking, right? And why it's important. Why is it important that we go on this mission? Is it just because some leader's curious? Is it because it really serves a useful purpose? Because people whose lives on the line can distinguish between the two. A nice to know versus must know. Must do versus nice to do. And in combat, soldiers don't like risking their lives for nice things. This better be important if I'm risking my life for it, or I'm not doing it. I get that psychologically. But we can't have soldiers making those individual decisions. Then discipline disintegrates. So it's a really tough question, but I think we need to broaden that question a little broader to what is it that we're doing and why are we doing it? Not from like a particular battle or a particular war, but what it means to serve and what the risks that are in place that are happening. I've talked about this very, very rarely because most people don't want to have that conversation. It's one of those unpleasant ones that people don't like to have, or usually you have them behind closed doors, those kinds of things. But it's a real important issue. I think it needs to have more discussion than it's ever had in the history of warfare that I'm aware of. And that is these honest conversations about what is it we're asking our service members to do, particularly in war, and what are they risking in the process of doing that? And is the burden being shared evenly? Because I will tell you, soldiers are very, very good at discerning. I'm sacrificing more than other people. I'm risking more than other people, right? Soldiers are really good at that. And when your life is on the line, you're hyper alert to any kind of injustices to fairness. So fairness is an underlying leader principle that I've written about as well. So I'll stop there. But thank you for that question. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the definitive answer, but I think it deserves more than a 10-second snide comment that I could provide to that. But it's just a tough one. It's a tough one from a conceptual leadership perspective. But again, it gets to how do we develop our leaders and how are we training our soldiers? Because they go hand in hand to do these kinds of tasks that you're risking your life for.
Так, пане Олеже, у вас ще є питання чи коментар?
Oleg, would you have a question or a comment?
Very short comment, Carl, about last question and I know few very good examples where soldiers were following their leader when leader was fighting with them, not just sending troops and stay in safe place. But and because we have a lot of civilians going to military, so they didn't create a professional identity that you have to serve, you have to kill or fight. So they don't have this in their skin. And the same time, it's also a big risk because when leader got killed, and there is a possibility, of course, so then the battalion, company, they can easily fall apart because good leader really was really concrete for the glue for the whole like regiment. Yeah, so this is tricky question, and probably some leaders, they choose this strategy to be with their soldiers, like in ancient times. Yeah, and some leaders, they have to be, let's say, more long-term strategical.
Ola, you froze there at the end. I'm not sure if you only froze for me.
No, it was just comment. So
yeah, no, you're spot on. You're spot on. You know, and you know, every leader will be different, but there are things that every leader can do to be effective. And you know, again, I would come back to these junior leader roles being essential, that they're trained, and so one can replace the other. But I'll stop there. But yeah, that's absolutely, it absolutely makes sense what you just said to me.
Так, я думаю, що можна завершувати.
I think that we can finish because we are limited in time. I would like to thank to our lecturers and guests. Thanks to the interpreters. We will post the recording on the 4Posts YouTube channel. You can send messages to Oksana or on our pages. And as soon as we post the recording, we will send you the links. Thanks to everybody for participation, and we will let you know about our following lectures on all of our channels and platforms. Thanks to everybody, and wish everybody a good evening.